Digital paint packages can do some amazing things, and a lot of that comes down to the power of the brush engine. And brush engines allow you to create your own brushes, which can be really good fun to play with, but they can also be quite complicated to understand. So today, in the first of two parts, what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about how brush engines work and just go through some of the basics to try and get you started. My name's Pete. Welcome to Basement Picasso. So today we're going to have a look at the brush creator, which you can find under Window, and then it's this option to bring up the brush creator. And that will give you a panel when you open it up, which has a lot of options around shape, pressure, sizes, opacities, angles, and all sorts of things. So there's a lot to look at. We're going to sort of keep it quite simple today and just look at some of the basics of what a brush is, how it works, and how you can start to make some adjustments to it. I'm using Rebelle 5, but a lot of these principles will work very similar for a lot of digital packages. So whether you're using things like Photoshop, Procreate, ArtRage, most of these things will have similar sorts of mechanisms that you can look at and understand. So the three things that we're going to talk about first of all are shape, grain, and canvas, and what the interactions are between these. So to begin with, we're going to look at shape, and you can see I've got a brush shape of a letter A. So that's a brush shape that I created myself. And when you click on that shape panel, you'll see that it brings up an image library that has all the default brush shapes that come with Rebelle, and then any that you've loaded in yourself. It's very easy to load them from external files, or you can also actually make them from shapes within Rebelle. So I've created this letter A shape, and the reason for that is just to try and make it very easy to see how the brush is working. So when I use the brush, you'll see that we get this stamped shape with the letter A in it. And you can see that that corresponds to the shape in that window. So the white in the shape is what's being printed. I'm currently using a blue colour, and the black means that nothing is being printed. So you can see the outer bounds of the shape, and that's ultimately what a digital brush is. It's a stamp that continually repeats that shape at a fixed interval. That's the basics of a digital brush. And everything that we're going to do from now on is going to be looking at making subtle changes to that to change how the brush is stamping those shapes and how that interacts with various things. So that's the basic brush. At the moment I've got grain set to white, so the grain is not causing any interactions, and I've also got the canvas set to white, so there's no canvas interaction. So all we're looking at the moment is the shape. Within the panel, we've got various options. We can rotate it, we can flip it. The one that's quite useful is invert. So if we click on invert, then you'll see that the shape inverts. We've now got black and white, but the principle is still the same. The white is the ink that is stamping, and therefore we're now stamping the letter A. You can see I've got pressure sensitivity on, so when I press lightly, I'm getting a very small stamp, and when I press hard, I'm getting a much bigger shape. And you can see that the stamp's cumulative, so as I continue to stamp over, it will just build up that colour and ultimately allow me to paint in. So that's the basics of what a digital stamp is. It's cumulative ink, effectively. So if we go back to the sort of outer square shape, and we'll start to work through some of these options. So The first thing I'm going to look at is under shape, we're going to look at spacing. So at the moment I've got spacing set to 100%. And what that means is that every next stamped shape will be 100% of the width of the brush apart. So you can see that each stamp is effectively one stamp space across, and it doesn't matter what size it's printing that at, it's always 100%. So basically the stamp is always just touching the next one. If we take the spacing up to 200, you can see a little bit in the preview up here, but if we actually draw some strokes, you'll see that now the stamping is getting spaced by the size of the next shape. So when the shapes are quite small, the gaps between them are quite small, and when I press harder to get bigger shapes, I'm getting bigger spaces between those letters. So the spacing percentage is fixed to the size of the next stamp shape. So you get proportional spaces relative to the size of the stamping at that point. And that obviously gives you a very kind of individual shape and allows you can do interesting things with brushes where you're just making very discrete marks because it's only printing very occasionally. If we clear that and then take the spacing down to a small number, so we come down to 50, what you'll see is that the shapes are now starting to overlap and you're getting something that looks much more like a brush stroke. And if we make the spacing very small, then you'll see that it's now almost continuous because it's printing so many shapes so quickly that it's all merging into one particular brush shape. And if we invert that so that you can see the A's, you can still just about see that it's printing the letter A, but they're merging together to really just start to become more of a brush shape with a little bit of characteristics around the edge. So it's now something that you can draw with and it's making a mark. So that's the basics of the spacing. And then we've got two things related to that. We've got spacing jitter and scatter. So all of the jitters work in the same way in that they introduce randomness to the stroke. So if we go back to our spacing of 100 and show that that's spacing each of the stamps perfectly touching the previous one, and then we put the spacing jitter up a little bit, then you'll see that it starts to introduce a little bit of randomness and there's a little bit of gaps between them. If we make that bigger, then you hopefully start to see that the spacing between them is now randomly spreading out quite a lot. And if we put the spacing jitter up to 100 and try and draw the same stroke again, you'll see that at times the stamp is ahead of the cursor and sometimes it's quite a bit behind the cursor because there's so much randomness that it ends up creating these big gaps in the line. So that allows you to start to create strokes that have randomness in terms of where it's drawing and where it's not. Even though you're drawing through it, it's creating randomness about where the stroke is actually going down. So spacing jitter, all the jitters give you randomness. Spacing jitter is about where those stamps are striking. Scatter does something very similar. So if I draw a line and increase the pressure and then decrease the pressure, if I put scatter on, I'll put it straight up to 200, the maximum, so you can really see what it's doing. If I try and draw over that exact line as best I can with the same sort of pressure, hopefully what you can see is the position of each stamp is scattering off the line left and right depending on where I'm going, and so I don't get that really smooth line. I'm getting the stamps scattering all around it, so it's still generally following the line that I'm creating, but each of those stamp marks is scattering around that path that I've traced out. So again, that introduces a lot of randomness and variety in terms of the mark that I'm making. So that gives you a little bit around the shapes. The next one that I want to look at is the opacity. So again, there's a jitter, and as we said before, jitter is going to introduce randomness. This time it's going to be for opacity. So there's already a tiny bit of opacity when I start the stroke, but most of these shapes are going down at 100% opacity. If I put opacity jitter on, I'll put it up to 100 just to really make it obvious, and then try and do a similar sort of stroke. What you'll see is that each stamp shape has a randomness as to exactly how opaque it is. Now that jitter is always less than, never more than, as I understand, and you can see that some of these shapes have been stamped with much more opacity. That one almost didn't show at all because the opacity was so strong in that one. And again, what that's doing is introducing randomness and character to the stroke and to what the brush is doing. So that's opacity jitter. There's a useful little icon up here, which is the reset brush changes. So what I'm doing is just clicking that between them, and that means that my brush always goes back to the start. And this is a demo brush that I created just specifically to have the right settings to be able to demonstrate all of these. So that's opacity jitter. The next one is size, and again, this is going to introduce randomness, this time to the size. So at the moment, the size is being driven by pressure. So it's pressure sensitive. When I press hard, I get a large shape. When I'm pressing soft, I'm getting a small shape. That pressure is being driven by this thing called size, and there's a curve associated with this. So if we have a look at this for a second, I'll just unpin this. You'll see there's a wee undock panel, which can be quite useful because that allows you to drag it around, and then you can see it a bit more clearly. So what this is showing you is this is the size, and because I've got a pen tablet and it's pressure sensitive, what it's showing is that the size at low pressure is very small, and then as it increases through the pressure, it is getting increasingly large in size. So when I'm pressing very hard, high pressure, I'm getting a very large size, and that's what you're seeing. So light pressure becomes a large pressure, and that's the pressure just going up that slope. You can do some interesting things with this. So we could turn that curve around, and now very quickly it's going to become a very large brush. So it's still possible to get very small strokes, but almost immediately it becomes really big. And you can do things like completely invert the brush shape. So when I press very lightly, I'm getting very big shapes, but then as I press more firmly, I actually get a small brush. You can see it's not quite going to zero, put it down to zero. Press really firmly, it goes to a very thin line when I'm pressing firmly, and then as I press more lightly, it gets bigger because this curve is inverted. So low pressure is a big brush and vice versa. So there's a lot of flexibility that you can do with these curves, and just they will change the basic behavior of the brush, but they will also give you very fine adjustments to control how the brush is feeling and what's happening when you're pressing more firmly, and it gives you a tremendous amount of control in terms of the feel of the brush relative to the tablet and stylus that you're using. And again, as before, when we reset the brush, you'll see that goes back to the default. So all of these settings are stored, and when you save the changes into the brush, all of these changes are saved. If you don't want them, you can reset them back and get back to the way the brush was behaving originally. So that's the basics of how you can do size control. If we just clear that layer again, so this is back to the brush behaving in the way it was originally designed, so low pressure becoming high pressure, gives us that scaling. And now what we're going to do is add some randomness to that. So if we try and draw the same curve starting with low pressure and then high pressure, you'll see that the low pressure didn't give me huge strikes, so it's not randomly doing very big things, it's always reducing it. But as I tried to do the large curve, a lot of them came out much smaller than they had done previously. Just do that again. Low pressure, medium pressure, and then hard pressure. But this time I'm getting a lot of much smaller things because the size is being randomly adjusted up and down to introduce variation. So that's the size one, and then the next one is one of the ones that for me particularly is more interesting because of a couple of things you can start to do with angle and rotation. So angle, first of all, because I've got a letter A, you can see the orientation of this. I'm actually going to invert this just to make this even easier to see. So you can see the direction of the A. It's in its normal orientation as you would write it. What angle does is you'll see the angle slides from 0 to 360. So it starts at 0. If we rotate it to 90, give or take, and then draw the same line, what you'll see is the letter A has been rotated clockwise 90 degrees. If I take the angle to 180, give or take, then you'll see that the letter A has been rotated 100, 172, didn't quite get 180. And you'll see that it doesn't matter what direction I paint in, if I go up, if I go down, if I go left, right, right, left, don't know my left from my right, it doesn't make any difference. That is the angle that letter is being stamped at every single time. I can go round in circles, can do whatever I want. Every stamp is being stamped at 172. So it takes that shape, rotates at 172 degrees, and then stamps it. If we take it to 270, give or take, then that will rotate it clockwise 270 degrees, which is the same as going back 90 degrees. And again, it doesn't matter which way I move, every letter is being stamped in the same one. If we take it to 360, that actually is all the way around the clock face and back to the start. So we've now got our letters back in the same position. So that can be useful depending on how you've drawn your brush shape. Is sometimes you want the brush to work in a particular direction, and you can sometimes need to adjust the angle to make it work correctly. So next we have angle jitter. So again, if we just draw a regular line and then put some angle jitter on, again this is going to introduce randomness, and this is going from 0 to 100, but that is effectively the percentage of the whole clock face, so it's equivalent of a 0 to 360 rotation. So what you'll see as I print that along is the letter can appear in almost any orientation, so it can rotate. So basically before it stamps, it does a rotation, a random rotation of anywhere between a 0 and 100 of the clock face, and then stamps that. So again, all of these things are just introducing interest and random characteristics to help make the brushes more interesting. Now, the next one is the one that can really start to make a brush feel interactive with the way that you're holding the pen. So at the moment, again, we're back to the default brush. I'll just reset it fully, but I will invert it so we're back on A, and you can see it's now back to that characteristic. And as I said before, it doesn't matter what direction you draw in, the direction of the brush stamp is always consistent. Under rotation, there's a few options here. So one of them is follow trajectory. And this will work for most basic styluses, even if it doesn't have tilt and direction support. And what you should see is now, when you draw a line horizontally, it looks the same. But if we draw in a circle, you'll see that the shape stamp is actually following the direction that the brush is moving in at any point in time. So if I draw up the way, I get different results. If I draw down the way, if I draw left to right, I get a different result if I draw right to left. So the brush angle is effectively following the trajectory. So it's working out the direction of the stroke and then using that as an angle adjustment on the brush head. So that certainly starts to give you a lot of interesting characteristics in the brush. The next one is similar to that. So if I take that off for a second and just draw a normal stroke and then put it on to, so there's two, pen tilt and pen rotation. On my tablet, both of these tend to work the same. But pen tilt is technically the angle between the pen being vertical of 90 degrees off the surface of the tablet, and then as you tilt it down, it's the difference between that angle and the angle that you're now holding it at. So it's a kind of 0 to 90 sort of adjustment. Whereas pen rotation, and you can see it in the little horizontal line, is actually the angle that I'm holding the brush at, so I can tilt it around. And that sort of control is really good for things like palette knives, where you can get sort of thin and thick lines. So with pen rotation, what you should now find is that if I'm holding the pen down the way, then I'm getting the same rotation, but as I start to rotate it around, I'm now getting control over the angle that the strike is being made at. And it doesn't matter which way I push, it's driven by the angle. So I can move the A's up and down, I can move them left to right, and I've got much more control over the direction that the mark is making. So those things really start to come to life when you start to use different types of brush heads. So if I use something like a really thin shape, and if I do this first of all, you'll see it's spaced very far out, so it doesn't really look quite right. So I'll put the spacing down to 1 so that it's striking a lot. And now we've got something that's given us a sort of palette knife type pushing mark. But the difference with this is it's now following the rotation that I've got here, so I can push it left and right, make a thick mark, or I can push it up and down and make a much thicker mark because I'm pushing along that edge. So this really starts to behave like a sort of palette knife, and then it gives you much more kind of interesting and intuitive marks. And that's in one of the recent demos I showed a more sophisticated brush that was using that kind of mechanism, but it was leveraging the rotation to give a really natural feel to being able to use the edge of something to push and pull in different ways. So the last two things we're going to have a look at are the grain and the canvas and how those interact. So we've got the basics of our brush again, and it's just doing the stamping of the shape. And that shape, the way to think about this is the maximum amount of ink that each stamp can put down. Because the grain is all white, the grain's not doing anything to interact with it. So if we have a look at the grain panels and have a look at some of the sorts of textures that we can apply, and pick one of those, then what you'll see is as we start to hit and put down each stamp, you can see that now a lot of the ink is missing, and that's effectively what the grain is doing. The grain is applying this pattern to the ink and effectively removing some of it, so that what you put down is what's left. It's almost like it's subtracting the ink before you actually make your stamp onto the paper. And what you can possibly see with this is the way that this is currently configured. Each of these stamps looks the same because the interaction of the grain with the stamp is always happening in the same place. So there's various options you can use down here in terms of the grain. So you can do things like a random offset, and what you should find then is that each shape is slightly different because the marks and subtractions are slightly different. So one of the things that can make a difference is if you enable tiled grains, and particularly when these grains are set up to be tiled. So what that means is the pattern is continuous. If you go off the right hand end, it joins seamlessly as it comes back on the left hand end. So that's what a tiled texture is. It can join seamlessly as you add multiple items together. And what that allows you to then do is, as you paint in, you'll see that the texture of that grain starts to appear, because that's ultimately what you're painting down. When the textures are quite dark, you'll see they have a big impact. They're subtracting a lot of ink, whereas if you take something that's brighter but not quite white, you'll see that it is subtracting some ink but not as much. So you're getting the randomness of the grain interacting, but still fundamentally getting most of the shape coming through, and the quality of the texture will obviously give you different sort of marks and results in terms of the feel of it. So you're really getting the interaction between the shape and then the grain, giving you this sort of quality within the ink that's being put down. And you can see the completely different results just from changing a few different grains. There's lots more you can do with the grains. In the next video will speak a lot more around some of the things that I do with text and shapes and random things that start to become very interesting within the grain mechanism. But that's the basic of a grain. It is removing some ink from the stamped shape. If we put that back to plain, then we can look at the other interaction, which is with the canvas. So again, we've gone back to the basics. So we've got no grain, no canvas. The only thing that's dictating what's going down at the moment is the shape and the dynamics on the shape. So if we bring up a canvas and apply the canvas and then look at that by comparison, when we press very lightly, what you'll see is that the canvas is interacting with the shape. So it is effectively as if the stamp is coming down on and only touching against the high points of the canvas, and therefore when we press very lightly, we're effectively picking out the peaks of the canvas, and therefore the canvas texture starts to come through in the actual picture. But when we start to press more heavily, we get to the point where the ink is just pressing right into the canvas as a whole, so we don't really get much texture coming through at the end. So there's a pressure sensitivity to the interaction with the canvas. So when you're pressing lightly, you get more of the canvas texture, and when you press heavily, you just block in the colour. So that's the interaction with the canvas, and then the last thing is that you can make those mechanisms, make all three of those mechanisms work together. So if you also have various grains, then you start to get these working together. So now the canvas and the grain are working together. So the grain's adding a bit of randomness, but because I'm pressing lightly, it's also only just picking up on the canvas. When I start to press really heavily, the grain is coming through rather than just letting it fill in everything solidly. And if we pick different grains, then we'll get different behaviours. So again, we're bringing out the canvas texture, and then as we start to paint in more solidly, we're not actually getting a complete shape because some of the grain texture is starting to come through. So you can see just by changing the grain, the behaviour of that brush and the marks that it was making is completely different depending on which grain we selected. So huge amount of variety and interest that you get without losing the basics of what the brush is doing in terms of interacting with the canvas and bringing out the canvas structure. So the three of these together interact, and as I say, the best way to think about it is the shape is the maximum amount of ink you can put down. The grain effectively removes some of that before you stamp each image, and the canvas is the physical structure that the stamp is resting on every time you stamp one of those little shapes, so you get the interaction with it. So I hope that's given you a little bit of a starter with digital brushes, the mechanism within Rebelle, and how you can start to understand what these different controls make. Hopefully that gives you enough to begin to look at doing some brushes of your own, or adjusting and tweaking some of the brushes that are there. We'll go into this in a lot more detail in the next video, but for just now, if you've got any thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comments below. If there's anything you'd like to see, then let me know, and I'll try and pull something together for you. And otherwise, if you can like, comment and subscribe, that is really helpful as we try to build up the channel. Very much appreciated, and if you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully see you next time.